Hi, this is Greg Kilstrom. Welcome to Season 3 of the Agile World, where we discuss customer and employee experience, organizational and workforce transformation, and how business can adapt and continually improve in an agile age. The Agile World podcast is brought to you by TEKsystems, an industry leader in full-stack technology services, talent services, and real-world application. For more information, go to teksystems.com. To read more about the topics discussed in this show, you can go to my website at theagile.world and read my latest articles, or get a copy of my latest book, The Agile Workforce, now available on Amazon and other retailers. My name is Greg Kilstrom, and I'm the host of the Agile World podcast. Today we're going to talk about some of the things that a shift to remote work has changed that may have gotten less notice than some obvious things like Zoom meeting fails, companies' lack of remote work policies, and other things that were first to be addressed. These are very real. There are very real human moments that are missed when we don't have face-to-face interaction. And while some things like this may be harder to quantify, they're no less important when we strive to create great employee experiences. To help me discuss this topic, I'd like to welcome a returning guest, John Friedman, author of Managing Sustainability: First Steps to First Class, and Sustainability Manager at WGL. John, welcome back to the show.
Well, thanks, Greg. I really appreciate being on twice. And I was going to, resist the temptation to just pretend to be on mute for the first few seconds. We've all gotten used to that. But that's one of those things that happens. That's a human moment. And it's the human moments that we lose or are in danger of losing when we go to, remote work, because you can be remote, distanced from your teams. And I've got a lot of experience having been a remote worker for several years prior to teleworking 1 day a week at Washington Gas, and now, being full-time remote for over a year.
Obviously, the last year's brought a big shift in how things have been done. And while there's talk of returning to some kind of, some people coming back to the office that were remote, but, what was different prior, because as you just mentioned, you managed a remote team well before COVID. What was different then? What's different now than it was back then?
I think the biggest difference is that those skeptical managers have discovered that your team can still be productive, and you can still work, but you can also still have the spirit of a team, and that connectivity between each other, that it can be done remotely, because that was the biggest resistance, is people didn't think it could be done. And it does have some advantages that people have discovered. My situation before was I was the only team member in North America. Everyone else was in Europe. So if something had to be done by first thing in the morning for Paris, I had 6 extra hours that I was working. So a lot of times my team would send something to me to finish up or tidy up, knowing that if I sent it back to them at the end of my workday at 5 o'clock here, it would be waiting for them first thing in the morning. So it gave us more coverage, both geographically and time-wise. But now what people are discovering is your best employee, the best person for the job, may not be right around the corner or down the street. You might not have to pay for a relocation.
There's good and bad with that, but I think to take the positive angle, all of a sudden the talent pool is so much larger, and I guess it does take a lot more understanding on the part of the managers, right? So you talked a bit about that. How does how do you think that's changed? As far, you mentioned it briefly here, but how do you think that was kind of a forced issue that happened, or do you think this has been something that's growing a little bit over time?
Well, I think it's a combination. I think it definitely was growing, and more people were getting comfortable with the idea of having remote workers or remote team or virtual. But COVID forced the issue. Even the most skeptical managers, when offices shut down, you have a choice. You either get the work done remotely or you don't get the work done. And I've often found that those who are most skeptical of remote work, the biggest question is, how do I know they're working?
Right.
How do I know they're working? Well, the answer is, do they answer emails? Do they answer to the phone call? Is the work getting done? It's often a mask for what's really a performance issue. And they know that the problem employee will take advantage of a remote situation. But That's why the system we had in place prior to COVID required people to maintain a performance rating of a certain level. The jobs had to be getting done. Telework was seen as a privilege, not a right. Now, what's happened is we've all earned that privilege, or most of us have earned that privilege. And,
Yeah.
that's a positive side. But to your point earlier, it's also a negative. It opens up the talent pool, but that also means that you, as a potential employee, are competing now with a wider swath of people, potentially from around the world, to do your job.
Yeah. Yeah, and to talk about the productivity angle and the just how do you manage someone, and understand if they're getting their job done. I mean, some of that, it's interesting. Some of that comes down to the trust issue of, it's funny when you see someone working at their desk, you assume that they're working and not on Facebook or playing solitaire or whatever, and yet we've seen some studies have shown for sure that productivity has actually increased with some remote workers. I mean, I believe there's, it's not a monolithic thing. I think some people are better suited to working remotely. I think some people need to work remotely to live their best lives, and I think some people actually do better coming into an office. And so it's not necessarily a one size fits all. But yeah, it has been kind of amusing to me to see that that fail safe, or it's kind of a lack of trust, I guess, thing in my mind, that okay, well, if I see them working and if they respond to emails timely, then they're a good worker. But that other person, they may work all hours of the day throughout, more of an integration with their life or whatever, and they're actually a good worker, but it's harder to see. Do you think that like 9 to 5 schedule, do you think that's going to change as a result of this?
I think in some cases it will. My boss and I have talked about it, and the idea is that we would, when we do go back, potentially keep 3 days a week remote and 2 days in the office, which is a big shift from 1 day a week remote.
Yeah.
But there have been instances, and there you talk about, there's some people that work better in isolation, and there's some people that work better with interaction. There's some things that work better in interaction. Brainstorming, very hard to do on Zoom. People tend to talk over each other because there's a lag and so forth, and people tend to get shut down. But then I've also heard people point out that because it's, you've got, let's say, a group of people on a Zoom call, there's the tendency to call upon the person who may look like they want to say something but hasn't spoken up in the meeting. So it allows for other voices to come into the room, that sometimes, depending on the dynamic of the team in person versus over whatever technology you're using.
Yeah.
But the other day, we had a rush deadline on something, and we needed something written in something like 3 hours. And ordinarily, if I were at the office, it would be very difficult. People coming in, you know, checking on it, walking by, what have you. But here, working from home, I just put on a little jazz. Okay, admitting a little process here, yeah, and sat down and just banged the thing out. Because
Yeah.
there are some things that you do better when you can concentrate in isolation. So I think it's going to have to be more a shift toward what is the best way for both the individuals and the team as a group to accomplish the tasks that are necessary.
So you talk and write and are an expert in corporate social responsibility as well. What do you think the pandemic has done to those types of CSR initiatives, and what's the future? Has a hybrid workplace of in office and remote, like, has that? Do you think that's going to have some impacts on CSR?
Gosh, I hope so, because there are, just as we talk about a commitment to diversity and inclusion, there are different work styles and different personalities that can now be more flexibly accommodated because people have seen it. We've also seen the impact on traffic and air pollution from mostly
Yeah.
traffic, but and things like that. So there are benefits that we have obtained and learnings that we've obtained through COVID. But the other thing is, we can't make the mistake of making it all about productivity and all about the work and making it overly transactional, because there's part of the workplace and part of a healthy team that is the connectivity between people, those tangential conversations where you run into each other in the kitchen or in the hallway and say, hey, how's it going? How's your son or daughter or whatever doing in college and what have you? And when we get hyper scheduled, which is what happens with remote, you have meetings and your Outlook calendar starts to look like the Partridge Family bus with all the colored squares, but you don't have time for those just you know casual conversations. So I've taken to with members of my team just looking on their calendar, seeing the green light, and knowing that they're therefore not in a meeting, and just calling them. And just as the same thing as if you were walking by someone's office and you saw them look up and you poked your head in and just said, something cheerful, just very short, very brief, and maintain that human element. So that's the big thing for corporate responsibility, because we want to be the workplaces where people want to work and can come work and can be fully engaged and bring their best self. And that human element is also part of it.
Definitely the culture, the company culture piece has undoubtedly been affected by, let's call it, the omnipresence of Zoom. um how do you, so and that's a great example of how you kind of get around that and build some personal interaction time. How might someone roll that out to their team? So in other words, how that's an action that you can take. But what advice would you have for someone that's managing a team, and you can't force people to call each other and do all those things? Like how would you approach trying to enable that in a company culture?
Well, as a manager, what I would do is when I'm talking to the people on my team or even other teams, I would say, hey, if you want to reach out to Andrew on this, or you think Christine might have a good perspective, give them a call, or just, see if you find a spot in their calendar and just impromptu, just ask them for their thoughts and opinions. Or if you feel like somebody might be in a conversation, you realize they might be feeling low or missing interaction, because some people really struggle with not having a team and not and are alone in a smaller place, and just say, hey, I know that so and so seems to be kind of struggling with the isolation. Why don't you give them a call and say hey? So you
Yeah,
can encourage it that way, not make it a mandate of you need to call people, or
yeah.
do it informally, because you're really talking about trying to create the informal. One thing I also do is I tend to wear a collared shirt when I'm working remotely, because I never know when my boss or someone else from the company might pop on my computer and say, "Hey, let's chat." And I don't want to be wearing my favorite, let's say, Van Halen T-shirt,
Right.
although I'm quite fond of it, because it just doesn't give especially when we were new in COVID and when I was working remotely, and my boss at the time was very uncomfortable with it. I didn't want to give the visual impression that I wasn't working as well. And so there are things you can do, but I think a lot of it comes down to suggestions. You don't need to dictate it.
Yeah,
If that makes sense.
yeah.
It's the human element that we're trying to make sure we don't lose. And a funny little aside is, when I was working remotely, I was actually the only remote member of my team, and they were all in Europe. And I came there one time, and there was this whole thing that had happened between two members of the team. They'd gotten into a big disagreement that everyone else was aware of, everyone else had seen and heard, and I was unaware of it. And I found myself feeling like fortunate, like, oh, I miss all the bad stuff that happens. Yeah. But then on the flip side of that, there were team birthday parties, happy hours, and things like that that I also miss. And so to be aware that your remote team members are missing some of that stuff, and it's not just to call them up and gossip about what happened, but also to say, hey, if we're going to do this happy hour, let's see if, I'll use my own name. See if John is available, and he'll be on his computer or his phone, but he could join us virtually.
Yeah, when we talked a little bit before this interview, you used a term, transactional. That our interactions have become much more transactional. You know, during and as we're hopefully nearing post COVID and things like that, and that really stuck with me, because there is um, this human element that, if everything is just my calendar is a grid, and okay, from this time to this time I'm interacting with this person or I'm doing this task, it does become it does we start to feel a lot more like we're simply machines or cogs in the wheel and everything like that. I mean, do you see do you see that things returning more to a culture of humanity, over time, or is it going to take a lot of intentionality from companies to kind of make that happen?
I don't think it happens by accident.
Yeah,
I think there has to be intentionality, at least the intentionality to let it happen. And like I said, to be informal about it and say, here's how we're going back to this workplace, because people have this desire, this, and I get it, I feel it too. Let's get back to normal. But we could also get back to something that is better than what we had before and remove some of those frustrations, so that if I am working on a writing project, and writing, I do better when I'm on my own. There have been other things that I've written collaboratively with a team, and if we could, and we've passed around a lot of drafts with, date and time on it, because there's so many drafts going around versus just sitting in the room and brainstorming. But how do you find that balance? I think it's going to be up to every company, and
yeah,
also every team, because the pendulum went from where it was to all the way to forced remote work. And now when it comes back toward whatever the middle is, I see it going back and forth as things evolve over time for people and teams and projects, because there may be some times when you really need all hands on deck and to physically be on deck and physically be there in person.
right.
And I don't think people should then learn to, resent that. I mean, I admit it, I don't miss my commute at all. And there were
Yeah,
nice friendly people on my train, but I don't miss that, and I certainly enjoy the time I can spend with my family, or enjoying the fact that when the workday ends I can get out on my bike and have more hours of daylight. So those are the pluses. But we can't only cling to the pluses of remote and ignore some of the downsides of it too. Like I said, like becoming so transactional that we stop having business relationships and just have, um, just the what can you do, get it done, move on. We don't
yeah,
take the moment to celebrate the success or those human elements. I found out a colleague of mine was pregnant when in the middle of a Zoom call, and she did it on purpose. She stood up,
yeah.
and everyone on the call stopped whatever they were doing, and we all took a moment to celebrate the fact that she was having a child, and we were also very happy for her. But
Yeah.
that's the kind of stuff that you lose if you're just head and shoulders square.
Yeah, and I think to your earlier point about it's kind of a pendulum, and we definitely did swing all the way to remote. Other than a handful of industries where that's simply not possible. We kind of swung to all the way to remote, and I do think, looking positively, I think we learned a lot about things that we can do, or even the example of at some point I'll do some more of these, but I would have a lot of like coffee meetings and all of those types of things that didn't really need, or in-person sales meetings, or things like that sometimes they don't always need to be, you don't need to drive 2 hours round trip to do things that can be done over Zoom, or there's other things like that. And I think to your point about writing, like anything that can be done asynchronously, I think we've learned that we can do that well. And then yeah, to the idea of collaborative brainstorming, Zoom just doesn't cut it for that. Try as these platforms might to add features and buttons and whatever, they're just not, they don't replicate that the same. But I believe the technology can be improved to help that, because I do think we're still going to have remote workers regardless. But yeah, I think to one of your points, I think we've learned some stuff, and now we need to kind of swing back somewhere towards the middle of a new reality, and hopefully that's a better one for everybody.
And I'll give one caution. It is very easy for disparities to crop up in a team or in an organization if some of the people are remote and some of the people are not. Because it becomes very easy to just ask the people who are there in person, and then those people who are remote can either be, and worse, can feel left out.
Yeah.
And so that's a big thing to watch out for as well, as we figure out, as the pendulum swings back and forth. And I'm not saying that the pendulum needs to go and swing back and be in one place. I think we need to be flexible and dynamic about, and elastic about how we view these things, and how we come back and let it sort of evolve organically, and what works for people. I think initially people are going to be over eager to be in person
Yeah.
because we've missed it.
Yeah, I think, I mean, particularly certain, the more extroverted, I think they've been, chomping at the bit, or so to speak, to get back in. Others, as an introvert, I got to say, I enjoyed my first couple months of lockdown just fine. But even somebody like me is ready to get out once in a while at least. But yeah, I mean, I think the other interesting thing to come out of this also is just um, the ethics, or the equality aspect of, how do you, as a manager, how do you make a decision that one person can work from home more or more often? I mean, back in the day, several years ago, and it wasn't even that long ago, but it used to be, I mean, certain people, they might come in a little bit late and get special exemption or whatever, but that was always like a bit of a privilege. And I think those that didn't have that apply to them maybe thought it was playing favorites or whatever. Like, how do you deal with that now, with when someone has legitimate needs, or they've seen that they need to do certain things, or else this job just doesn't work for them? Like, how do you handle that disparity between different types of team members, even if they all live locally?
I think part of it comes down to the job, what the role is. Do they
Yeah.
need to be on site to do their role? I've had colleagues whose job is to be out in the community, and they're attending events and luncheons and so forth, and doing the interactions that are essential for their role, but they're not physically in the office. And I don't know what time they start, or what time, they might roll in at 10 o'clock, but they might have been in a breakfast meeting since 7:30,
Yeah.
or, and then had to take, the hour to get across town, because so that cuts into their day. So I think we need to stop looking at each other and saying, oh, does so and so have a privilege, or does so and so have something that I don't? It's really, am I being fully realized, fully engaged? And it gets to the idea of diversity and inclusion. People want to be included differently, or need to be. I
Yeah.
have a colleague who's got a new child. Their child care schedules are going to have to be accommodated. Does that mean everyone should leave when his wife can't pick up the baby, so he has to leave work early? So
Right.
everyone gets to leave work early. I mean, I'm trying to make a point with humor that would
Right.
be ridiculous, but no one would expect that. And so that as we come back, we're going to have to figure that out as well. But I think favoritism and resentments are a possibility when people have different privileges based on, let's say, performance. When it's a job role, people don't question it, but it's when you've earned it, it's a little trickier.
Well, one last question before we wrap up. So you've written a book about sustainability, and write for some of the top publications on the subject. What should the pandemic and our recovery from it teach companies about sustainability, and how can we make some good come from everything we've been going through this last year?
One of the things I hope that people start to do is really look at the need to listen to the experts, whether they be medical professionals or climate scientists. That we've been warned, and we knew that disease outbreaks could happen, and with globalization, that it would be easy for something to transmit around the world. Obviously, COVID is, with all these variants, this thing can really evolve quickly, and is finding homes and host communities. As more of us get vaccinated, it's figuring out, not that it's scheming, but it's just by the nature of it being transmitted. Oh, that person's protected, and it ends up at this younger host, and so now we're seeing it shift to the younger people. All of this was predictable.
Right.
Climate change is predictable. issues like social justice. We've been talking about them for years, decades. And we're starting to see, and again, I think because we're all at home and the only connection we have necessarily to the outside world is to pay attention to some of these things, is that hopefully we will all, as businesses and individuals, pay attention to these things and do more and not just expect someone else to do it. I get completely annoyed when I hear people say things like, well, it'll be up to the next generation to cure climate change.
Right.
Well, my response to that is, okay, so I guess you're retiring since you've just ceded responsibility for it.
Right. Right.
Yeah, we're still here. Our retirements and becoming obsolete is going to happen to us fast enough. But while we're here, let us continue to do what we can do, whether it's environmentally, socially, governance, ethically, what have you, to move the needle forward, whether we can do it incrementally or transformationally, to make this a world where we can all live together in peace, harmony, and health.
Yeah.
That was pretty high end for a very simple, structured question, wasn't it?
It's a nice way to wrap things up. Well, John, thanks so much for joining again. Great to have you back on the show, and always love talking with you. For those listening, what's the best way for them to keep up with what you're doing?
I'm at John Friedman on Twitter. I'm on LinkedIn. If people are interested in the book, you can get it at businessexpertpress.com. And and of course, my email is johnfriedmancsr@gmail.com.
Wonderful. Well, again, I'd like to thank John Friedman, author of Managing Sustainability, First Steps to First Class, and Sustainability Manager at WGL, for joining the show. Thanks for listening to The Agile World with Greg Kihlstrom. See you next week. Thanks again for listening to the Agile World podcast, brought to you by Tech Systems. I'm your host, Greg Kihlstrom. If you enjoyed the show, please take a minute to subscribe on your podcast channel of choice and leave us a rating so that others can find the show more easily. You can learn more and get a copy of my latest book, The Agile Workforce, from my website at theagile.world.